This week, the tour of the National Park Service sites takes us to West Virginia and the parks along the New River Gorge. Calling this particular river in West Virginia the New River is kind of ironic, since this river, like the Colorado flowing through the Grand Canyon, has been doing so for longer than just about any river on the continent. It's literally one of the oldest rivers there is. Anyway, I'm calling out the Richmond Hamilton Farm, initially granted to a Revolutionary War veteran in 1796. The farm is an example of the sort of self-sufficient homesteads people were moving to in what was the frontier at the time I'm covering right now, where everything was either brought in with quite a bit of painstaking trouble, mostly nails and flour and cotton or linen cloth, or it was made on site. The utter age of this site can be seen in the still standing barn made of on-site, hand-cut chestnut logs. Due to the bringing of the chestnut blight from European chestnuts, there are no large American chestnuts anywhere on the continent anymore. Logs this large are a symbol of an extinct tree. So this farm and other locations around the New River Gorge Park and Preserve show how most people lived for most of the life of this country, on farms or in little towns that supported the farmers and connected them with the larger world. So to see a farm dating back to our period of war and adventure, and an American canyon I bet you didn't know about, take a drive to the Richmond Hamilton Farm in the New River Gorge in West Virginia. Episode 107, Squash and Taters, Corner Fillers. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the other major carbohydrate sources of the Americas that filled out the war, adventure, and frontier diet of early America on the move. The cultures that colonized America were bread people, but that didn't always work for people on the move. This week, we'll look at how squash and potatoes filled in. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in these years of war and adventure, the stationary requirements of making bread meant many a soldier, trapper, traveler, and all manner of people moving out to the frontier did not have access to the plows, sickles, threshers, mills, and ovens necessary for making a loaf of bread. And this doesn't really take into account the sheer amount of effort required to go from seed to grain ready to mill. Successful farming and processing of bread grains just to get them to the mill for grinding is best done with a large community working together. Planting, harvesting, and then threshing are long, hard tasks and require a significant support crew to cook food to feed the workforce, livestock included. At least one smith to ready and sharpen tools, time and material and other support tools to keep together the animal harnesses and tools used in planting, harvesting, and threshing, and then a way to store and transport the grain once it's released from the seed heads at the end of the grass stalks it grows on. All of this support infrastructure takes time, energy, and ideally a community of people staying in one place to pull it off. Wandering around exploring, fighting, or moving to a new home as a single family generally is not a situation that makes the production of grains for bread possible. But humans cannot live by meat alone, certainly not those that were working as constantly and as hard as our early Americans. Carbohydrates were absolutely required to keep body and soul together. So without access to all that equipment and time needed for making bread, how was that carbohydrate requirement met? Starchy vegetable matter. That is, squash, specifically the hard-shelled, long-keeping winter squash, and potatoes. A quick reminder of what squash we're talking about, the American food before there was even an America. The squash category includes pumpkins, of course, but pumpkin, if you'll remember, is a laundering of the imported word pompion from England. that originally was applied to large, swollen melons. The squash our early Americans were eating certainly included the swollen bright orange pumpkin, but they were also consuming squash in a range of other colors. Tan beiges, dark crimsons, yellows, and green with or without yellow stripes. And the shapes were variable and strange. Of course, there were the familiar globes and ovals, but the squashes also came in long crescent shapes with pointed ends or bulbous ends and long curving necks. They might also look like giant acorns or lozenges. And they could easily range in size from a convenient large handful to monsters, stretching out to 4 feet long, or globes large enough to inspire nursery rhymes that talked about using them as a place to shelter wives. If you don't recall, Peter Pumpkin Eater had a wife and couldn't keep her, put her in a pumpkin shell, and there he kept her very well. In fact, just about all squash are more or less interfertile with each other and can hybridize endlessly. There will always be more varieties of squash appearing. Just which ones are tasty and easy to grow will limit which ones actually thrive by being shared and spread around. You may also remember from season 1 that I talked about how squash and pumpkins were a bit denigrated by the earliest colonists as lazy man's food. This was an advantage to the early Americans on the move, or those just setting up house somewhere. Squash could more or less just be planted, and those hardy vines would do a pretty good job of looking after themselves. They were suited to the local climate after all. And for military folks, recently abandoned farms, both belonging to colonists and the displaced locals, could be depended on to keep producing volunteer squash for several years. They're persistent vegetables. Well, okay, technically persistent fruits because they have seeds inside after all. The potatoes are a bit more complicated to describe. All potatoes are food of the Americas, but there are 2 distinct categories. Just to make things interesting, the items we collectively call potatoes are the tubers of 2 different plants. If you want a real deep dive or a reminder of it all, pull up episode 79 for all the world traveling and historical detail you could stand. For this episode, I'll just throw down a few quick reminder facts. First, there are the sweet potatoes, or yams, since they are the ones that show up first in the America that this podcast is concerned with. In our earliest America, the food items that were called sweet potatoes, or yams, were only generally known to people living somewhere in Virginia and south. And these are the tuber of a vine from a plant in the genus Ipomea, the same genus that contains morning glory, water spinach, and bindweed. The Taino people of the Caribbean called them batata, which became the first half underlying the modern potato word. All varieties were cold sensitive, which limited the range of sweet potatoes, but they spread east and west from coast to coast in South and Central America. Their warm weather habit meant that it became the tropical island potato, traveling with people who settled islands in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, which meant that sweet potatoes met European colonizers not only on the American continents, but in the Caribbean islands and the Polynesian ones. Sweet potato was therefore the first potato imported into Europe as a result of the Columbian Exchange. The yam moniker that was slapped on these usually yellow or orange-fleshed tubers was initially done so by the enslaved Africans who found themselves toiling in the agricultural conquest of the American Southeast. These American yams, these sweet potatoes, were acting as a stand-in for the true African yams many people of West Africa had grown up eating. The sweet potato yam double name of these orangey brown, skinned, pointy-ended tubers has been with us from the start and has caused naming confusion the whole time. So the sweet potato, it was the first world traveler. The fact that it can be eaten raw with no digestive consequences, and the fact that its leaves are edible made it a popular plant indeed. But as America spread into cooler climates more than it did into warmer ones initially, meant that the sweet potato's popularity in early America, especially traveling America, would be limited. And the carryover suspicion of raw vegetables meant that American food would never then, or now, contain much raw sweet potato anywhere. The second potato, known at this point in history as the Irish potato, Virginia potato, or occasionally as the bastard potato, is also a native vegetable of the Americas. When the Spaniards brought it back to Europe, it seems to have arrived with the name papa, along with the news of these people, the Incas. However, its earliest home was in colder climes. The savory tuber was originally cultivated in the area found at the Peru-Bolivia border. Well within the tropics, but so high in elevation, temperatures were regularly too cold for both the Ipomeo batata and maize. This hardier plant, a member of the Solanaceae family, would roll down the west coast of the continent of South America and be picked up by the Spanish explorers checking out the coast of what is now Chile. While people of the time were typically less literate and intimidated by a large array of mechanical and metal devices, your average 16th, 17th, and 18th century person had botanical awareness that would put most modern people to shame. As a result, the arrival of these starchy, savory potatoes in Northern Europe was met with some suspicion, because the best-known European Solanaceae was nightshade. Quick detour. Belladonna, or nightshade, was the sort of Tide Pod of its day. It had a variety of valid medical uses, in ointments to treat chronic body pains, in tinctures to dilate eyes, and in mixtures to treat a variety of stomach and bowel trouble. But the glossy dark purple berries were attractive looking and somewhat sweet tasting, and they could fatally poison small children and cause hallucinations and vomiting in the children and adults they didn't kill. The poison and hallucinatory effects meant that some people would use the growing of nightshades as a way to accuse others of witchcraft. A generally silly thing, as most women would have a portion of their kitchen or home garden dedicated to medicinal plants like this and others that could be poisonous. Regardless, the arrival of the papa potato was met with some skepticism, but once it was clear what benefits the tuber offered, long stable storage, tasty cooked starch, and a full belly, this potato spread rapidly all over Europe, eventually largely replacing or at least augmenting its native European analogs, scarrots, turnips, and rutabagas. The scarrot was a skinny tuber, also known as witch knuckle or witch fingers to give you an idea of its appearance, and that required much more work to harvest, clean, and cook. Turnips have a notoriously mildly sulfurous flavor, and rutabagas taste a bit turnipy and a bit sweet, and all of them require careful dry storage so as not to go mushy and slimy over the winter and into the hungry spring. The savory papa potatoes were much easier to grow, and their rough, dry skin protected them better in storage and made it so they could easily be roasted in the coals just in their skin, as well as being added to stews. And unlike their brassica rivals, they had a mild flavor and were less likely to cause sulfury burps or to increase one's production of the wind. The upper classes had fits of suspicion on and off in the 17th and even 18th centuries regarding this papa potato. Along with the nightshade thing, it was also seen as a base food. Remember humorism from season 1? These things grew not just at ground level, but actually underground. They were too cold, too earthbound, and too phlegmy for the finer, higher souls of the ruling class. Just as with corn and rye, if they weren't considered poisonous exactly, these potatoes were considered too rough, only fit for those who did the roughest work. The workers in the silver mines of Potosi, Bolivia, that was sending silver by the literal shipload to Madrid and China, those people ate mainly potatoes. But the farming classes adopted this papa potato fairly quickly, even though all parts of the potato that grow above ground are poisonous. The stems, the leaves, even the little potato fruits. They all contain a variety of glycoalkaloids, the most common of which is solanine. Raw potatoes also contain a limited amount of solanine, and potatoes that have turned green due to light exposure also start producing some as well. This is why there are really no raw potato recipes. Not only is the watery, grainy texture generally unpleasant, consuming too much raw potato leads to stomach upset. Note, modern potatoes are bred so that even in their raw or slightly green state, the worst that will happen is that you'll get uncomfortable stomach cramps, and even for that, you'd have to eat a few entire raw potatoes. But cook your potatoes thoroughly so they're pleasant to eat, and what little glycoalkaloids they contain are destroyed, even were there to be a few little green spots. But generally avoid any bright green potatoes. That's just not a good potato color, no matter how it got that way. But white, yellow, red, or purple are all fine and tasty. Anyway, the white-fleshed, rough brown skin potato was the sort that mainly spread about Europe, largely feeding the poor, stretching out stews, eking out bread flour into potato loaves or potato pancakes and such. Until the upper class started mixing these savory potatoes with butter and cream and cheese and even egg yolks, then suddenly things like pomme duchesse began to appear, and the frying of potatoes was figured out, and pomme dauphine and pomme frite simply took over. When brown-skinned, white-fleshed, starchy, savory papa potatoes, or as the early Americans knew them, Irish potatoes, turned up in New England in the early 18th century, they were seen as a farmer food for sure. But everyone was living a bit on the edge, even the well-to-do from time to time. So food was food, and the classes simply weren't as rigidly held. And so, in America, the white potato, the Irish potato, enjoyed general popularity. So here we are. Grains are a lot of work to grow, and bread is a lot of work to make. Therefore, every soldier, adventurer, or pioneer that lacked the support system to successfully make bread turned these three starchy plant foods, tubers and fruits, to make up a goodly part of the foods that filled in the spaces around their other meat and veg. So how did our groups on the move tend to consume these starchy staples in this time of war and adventure? Hands down, for our early Americans on the move, the favorite way to consume the vegetable foods was roasted, alongside the fire for more tender squash, or buried in the coals for both kinds of potatoes. Encased in their own flesh, all of these were hard to mess up next to a fire. At worst, they might have a steam outburst through the skin, but they would still be fine and sound to eat inside. The skins of the potatoes and the squash protected the flesh from drying out, and the high water content would keep them from burning. And any char on the outside would only add flavor. This was especially welcome as flavoring because many of the soldiers on the move and adventurers after game or new frontiers often found themselves short of salt. So what about using larger squash, the pumpkin-y types especially, as a cooking vessel? While this method isn't particularly recorded in formal cookbooks, it is a method that was noted as in use by many of the locals, the Native Americans. Journals recounting meals at the villages of the indigenous people do recount the use of large pumpkins used to cook small game inside. These filled, large, round squash might be roasted next to the fire or buried in the pit cooking tradition. While such practice flew in the face of the European cooking traditions that depended on metal, crockery, and spits, it's not hard to see that using a pumpkin to contain other items and cook it might occur to more than one frontier woman, improvising food to stave off boredom and deal with lost or worn-out pots. For the slightly more well-equipped diner on the move, the most common way to cook both squash and potatoes was to cut up and toss them in soups or stews. Well, they would have been called pottages at the time. To stew was still a verb. It hadn't moved over to noun status yet. While one rabbit or a brace of pigeons, that's a pair, might not make for much stew on their own, padding out the broth with these starchy items was a common way to fill more bellies. Also typical, since potatoes and squash chunks can take a while to cook through and take on the flavor of the broth, the meat from a soup or a pottage might be served at dinner or supper with bread one day, and then the vegetables added to simmer over the coals overnight. The resulting mixture would cool as the fire died, but the vegetables would be cooked and ready to go in the morning. a savory and filling meal to be eaten as the pot is cleaned out at breakfast, packed up, and made ready for the road the next morning. Depending on how thoroughly the vegetable matter had cooked and what the morning schedule looked like, these chunks of meat broth, cooked potatoes, or squash might be eaten as is, or they might be turned into a mush, or as we are much more likely to say these days, a mash. Mashing up starchy vegetables, turnips, squash, potatoes, and such to accompany a meat dish was popular then as it is popular now. But what liquid was used to loosen up the mash would be, well, dependent on the season, the time and the equipment one had, and what class of people one was. Clearly on the road and lacking much of a pantry, last night's broth from the salt pork or the local game would just be about all there was. Or possibly a little water or a bit of the beer ration if one was in camp. Now, if you were higher up in the military ranks and had access to an officer's cook, salt and even possibly some sort of fat might be added. Suet, pork fat, or something left from an especially well-endowed duck or goose. In season, that is spring and summer, there might be some butter or cream, but only if there were bits and ends of those items that needed to not go to waste. For an event that was especially fine, visiting dignitaries or a dinner that included wives, spices might come into the mix. Not just salt, but maybe even some sort of pepper, black, long, or chili might be added. But to be clear, all these mashes up and down the ranks would be a chunky mash of vegetables. Down in the richest Creole avenues of New Orleans, or possibly at the fancy tables of large plantation owners or presidents, one might find something resembling our modern mashed potatoes, or even a fancy French pomme puree. But for everyone on the move, those squash and potatoes were being mashed with just a wooden spoon. No one was carrying a heavy mortar and pestle on campaign, except possibly a general's cook, and the fine metal wire sieves, tammies, and food mills used to make smooth purees are still several innovations away. Our modern association of milk and cream in these starchy vegetable mashes was nearly unheard of. First of all, for the marching soldier and those traveling to a new home or off on adventure, dairy products other than some hard cheese that travels well would have been entirely off the table. Literally. Dairy at this time required a stable, stationary life with a community to support the raising of dairy cows and an economic base that would eat up all the dairy when it was in season. War and adventure support none of this. The last place our people and country on the move would place these starchy vegetable foods were in puddings and pies. You need to remember that pudding and pie were just as likely to be savory as sweet at this point. In fact, some of the pies we might consider as dessert pies were not as sweet as we would expect them to be, the price of sugar and all, and they were served alongside the savory foods at dinner. And quick reminder, dinner's the big meal of the day, usually where we put lunch, but again, for people on the move, in the midst of adventure and war, this could of course vary. The big meal might come at the end of the march if it were that kind of day. Pudding for our early Americans at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, it meant something smashed up smooth and held together with a variety of binders. Eggs were the best, though breadcrumbs were the most common typical addition. And of course, if it were spring or if one was rather rich, there could be a custard base using the binding power of both milk or cream and eggs. Such riches. So at the bottom end of the social ladder, a squash or potato pudding, either sort of potato. What held it together simply depended on what was at hand for our people on the move. While something like hasty pudding, a stirred dish cooked over a fire, could generally be cooked by men, a pudding made of these ingredients that we're talking about meant that there were women about, because these puddings required baking. And the fine art of baking, even if it was just in a kettle, required a great deal of practice and skill to make even attempting a pudding worth the trouble. Also, puddings require a separate dish for the baking. Unlike soups and pottages and mashes, a pudding requires more than a kettle or a cauldron. That said, there were plenty of women along for both war and adventure. In war, the campaign communities that lived with the soldiers either fully sanctioned as families or semi-sanctioned as an acknowledgement that 18th and early 19th century armies of all men were absolutely and entirely impossible. Men would be dying of flea infestations and sores from unwashed clothing, as well as dying from a combination of starvation and malnutrition, just like those womanless adventurers who went off to Jamestown all the way back in 1607. No bread, no beer, just eating horses and dogs while wearing filthy, disintegrating clothing. Yes, that fiasco was one of the guiding memories that caused George Washington, as much as he hated them, to allow a campaign community, or as he called them, camp followers, to accompany the Continental Army. In a situation of short rations and no pay, there was a chance that the occasional squash pudding would keep down the desertion rate. To make a squash or potato pudding, a large mortar and pestle would be a big help, but regardless, the vegetable matter in question would need to be cooked quite soft. This was usually accomplished by cooking the item in a small amount of water over a low fire for a few hours. Once it was soft and drained and smashed quite fine, the other ingredients could be added. The least fancy puddings would be made with water or broth, breadcrumbs, and whatever salt and spices were to hand. If the situation was a bit more refined, eggs would come into the mix and maybe even some molasses. The mixture would be poured into a dish and cooked until it puffed. In a finer and fancier kitchen, back to a colonel's or a general's headquarters, there might even be a pastry crust lining the baking pan, and only the yolks of the eggs would be used, not whole ones. And of course, a wider variety of spices, including nutmeg, mace, ginger, cinnamon, and maybe even a bit of sack, that is sweet wine, could be added for flavoring. And so, at last, we get to pies. Now, this is another baked food and one that required flour and a flat surface and pie crust making skill. So as you might imagine, pies only happened in well-established forts or camps, or when an adventure or a move to a new home was complete. And women were on hand to make the crusts and do the baking. Which is to say, alas, pies really were not particularly a food of war and adventure at all. But as filling food that was pretty easy to find, easy to keep, and as long as you didn't get too fancy, easy to cook, squash and potatoes were an important component of the diet of the early Americans on the move. They could fill the void left by missing bread when baking or even flour just weren't possible. Squash and potato mashes went well with the salt pork and the wild game soldiers and explorers were most likely to get their hands on. Or these mashes could be an entire meal all on their own, which in an age plagued with malnutrition was a good thing. Squash and potatoes, both kinds, have vitamin C to spare and plenty of minerals that are hard to get from an otherwise meat and vinegar pickled vegetable diet. I mean, the fact that white or savory potatoes, the papa potatoes, are such a convincing bread substitute, we forget how nutritionally awesome they are. Anyway, explore the food of the Americas. Eat more squash and taters. Next week, it's time to visit our essential cooking companion, wood. For fuel, for transport, for making, carrying containers. How did wood supplies of different sorts impact the people on the move in early America? I'll be back with that next time. It should be next week, but we'll see in this higgledy-piggledy time of year. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there. But even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? I am continuing my deep dive into the 19th century with my co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. Our goal is to look at all this historical stuff in context and also to enjoy or criticize the modern media that covers this period in time. Prize-fighters, circus freaks, and gangsters is still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud. Well, crime. Straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. So join us. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Instagram as @THOA Food. But alas, I'm pretty much all X'd out. All this information is available in the show description.